my name is Sky Gill. I am a statistical and data sciences major and a double minor in sociology and environmental studies. I was advised by Dr. Hoare on this project, and the title of my project is Finding a Way Home, Examining Outcomes of Foster Care After Maltreatment. So before I go into my research and outcomes and conclusions and all of that, I want to acknowledge that the data I was working with is full of real foster care children and their families. So each, observation is real people. And so that being said, it's hard to, draw general conclusions and make sweeping generalizations about what is good for foster care, quote unquote, or, if a child has certain characteristics, then the foster care system should respond in this way. And that's not what I'm trying to do, but I do want to, I am aiming to examine the outcomes of foster care in relation to certain foster child characteristics. So I did my data analysis using R, which is a statistical software program. I specifically was interested in maltreatment type and disability in relation to outcomes of foster care, although I do examine other characteristics as well. And I wanted to create an easily accessible and impactful project. So although I don't want to discount the value of a written thesis, as most students at Wooster do, I wanted to create something that would be more easily digestible for the general public and hopefully more, accessible for any person to look at my project and learn a bit more about the foster care system. And so I chose to create interactive Tableau dashboards. Tableau is a data visualization software. And I made these dashboards so that a user can filter by characteristics that they're interested in and really see results of the analysis and see the data in the view that they are interested in terms of, characteristics or location, etc. So some background. In 2019, which is the year of the data that I was working with, there were over 600,000 children in foster care. Additionally, over 23,000 children age out of foster care each year, which means that they reach 18 and are no longer part of the system as adults. And aging out of the system has some very detrimental impacts for a lot of individuals. So although many foster children show interest in college, only about 3% of children who age out get a degree. Additionally, 70% of women who age out are pregnant before 21, and 20% of individuals become instantly homeless when they age out of the system. Something else important to keep in mind as I talk through my project is the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980. So this act was put in place to ensure that states make a reasonable effort to reunify children with their biological parents, except in cases of quote unquote extreme circumstances or exceptional circumstances, which could include sexual abuse or attempted murder of a child or a child's sibling. And this is just important to keep in mind because although I am looking at characteristics in relation to outcomes, it's just important to keep in mind that reunification is the most common and the most, the outcome that states push for, I guess you could say, the most because of this act, states are required to do that. So some previous findings that influenced my project were a study by Fetro et al. That showed failed reunification. So the study looked at 16 cases of foster children ages 4 through 7 who were reunited with their biological parents. And 5 out of those 16 cases, the reunification failed and the child was placed in foster care again. And several of those were for the same or similar reasons that they were placed in foster care the first time. So this just shows that although reunification is the goal, it may not be the most beneficial for some children. Additionally, looking at some characteristics of children who are adopted most often, typically they are young, white, and disabled. And so I do include these characteristics in my analysis and also additionally add some more characteristics. The data that I used came from the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect. I had two data sets. One was a foster care file that had children who were in foster care in 2019, whether that be they were placed in foster care in 2019, placed in foster care previously, but not yet discharged by 2019. Additionally, I had a second data set that looked at or contained observations of child abuse in 2019. And so this included the type of maltreatment, as well as services that were provided to the child and the family after the abuse occurred. And so I merged these two data sets together using the foster care ID. So only children who were placed in foster care are in this final merged data set. So not all children in the final data set have a report of child abuse, because if they were placed in foster care prior to 2019, that report of child abuse would have been from previous to 2019, and I only had the data set for the child abuse records from 2019. Lastly, on the data, I just want to touch on the format of the data and how that impacted some of the visualizations. So a child can experience multiple types of maltreatment, and because of this, each child is listed in the data set multiple times. So a child has one record for the first type of maltreatment that they experience, and then a second record including the second type of maltreatment, et cetera, up to 3 types. So each child is in the data set 3 times, even if they only experienced 1 or 2 types of maltreatment. In this case, the other 1 or 2 rows would have a null or an NA value. And so this comes into play in some of the visualizations. So it's just important to remember that if you're looking at a visualization that includes types of maltreatment, the total number of children represented in that visualization is going to be more than the total number of children who experience maltreatment in general, because a child can experience multiple types. So to talk about some important variables before I go to show you all the dashboard. Child outcome, I split into 4 categories for this analysis: adoption, aging out, reunification, and alternate outcome. Alternate outcome includes guardianship or placement with another family member, etc. And I split it into these categories because I'm most interested in adoption, aging out, and reunification, since those are most common. And also, as we saw previously, aging out has a lot of those detrimental impacts on many individuals. Secondly, maltreatment type. As I said, a child can experience more than one type of maltreatment, and we will see the specific types on some of the visualizations. Total removals and total days in foster care refers to the total number of times that a child has been removed from their home and placed in foster care over the course of their life. And the total days is the total number of days that they've spent in foster care over all the removals that they've experienced. Report victim and child prior. A child is considered a victim on a report if maltreatment is found to be substantiated or suspected following an investigation into the maltreatment. And child prior refers to whether a child has been a prior victim of maltreatment, using those same standards to determine whether they're a victim or not. Perpetrator prior refers to whether a perpetrator has previously committed maltreatment, again, determined in the same way when considering the investigation of the maltreatment. If it's found substantiated or suspected, that person is considered a perpetrator. Lastly, perpetrator 1 age is used. A child can have more than one perpetrator, but I found that even in the case of a child having 2 or 3 perpetrators, their ages tended to be close. So all the perpetrators tended to be close in age if a child had multiple perpetrators. So I use perpetrator 1 age, and that can be kind of used as a quote unquote proxy for other perpetrator ages if there is more than one perpetrator. So now I am going to move to the interactive dashboards and kind of go through an example of how they can be used. So this first slide, I know has a lot of words on it, but this is basically everything that I just went through, explaining the background and the impetus for this project, as well as creating the dashboards as opposed to a thesis. Going to variable explanation, this explains the variables as I did on the last slide on the PowerPoint. So again, these first two slides are kind of just for reference. If you were to go back and look at this dashboard later, you could remember the information. So this, I know, also has a lot of words on it. I'm going to go through it. This is a table showing the results of a model that I made. And the statistical model was to basically help determine the relationship between certain characteristics and a child's chance of adoption as opposed to reunification. So as I said, this table is showing chances of adoption opposed to reunification. On the next page, you'll see the full model results, which show adoption opposed to reunification, aging out opposed to reunification, and alternate outcome opposed to reunification. So in the text on this page, it kind of explains how to read the table, as well as what the symbols mean, etc. But just looking at a few examples, so if we look at disability, we can see that green upward arrow. So that means that if a child has a disability, their chance of adoption as opposed to reunification increases when compared to a child that does not have a disability. Next, if we look at increase in child age, we can see that red downward arrow. And so that means that when a child, or as a child's age increases, their chance of adoption as opposed to reunification decreases. So essentially that's showing that an older child has a lower chance of adoption as opposed to reunification than a younger child. Lastly, we'll look at one of the horizontal yellow dashes. So if we look at medical neglect, that horizontal dash means that the chance of a child being adopted versus reunified is approximately equal for children who experience medical neglect and those who do not. And so those are just a few examples. There's some more explained in the text on the side. But if we go to the full model results, we can see all three tables next to each other, and you can kind of compare how the predictors impact the chance of certain outcomes as opposed to reunification. So next, this page has an example walkthrough and some conclusions that can be drawn. I'm going to be showing this example during this presentation, so I'm going to go through and point things out on the graphs, but this is just the text explanation of what I'm going to be talking about. So going to the visualizations, first we see this map that has distribution of characteristics across the United States. So obviously it's showing all the states in the US, and this drop down in the top can be used to select a different characteristics that it's showing. So maybe you're interested in median total days in foster care. So you can click on that and you'll see the results for that. And this legend in the bottom right corner kind of shows that a darker color means there's a higher value for whatever characteristic you're looking at. So for the example of this walkthrough, I'm just going to stick with the aggregate results for all states. However, this map is interactive. So if you wanted to look at a specific state, for example, Ohio, you could click on that and it would take you to this page, which would be then filtered by that state that you're interested in. But again, I'm just going to focus on the aggregate results. So we can next go to overview. And for this walkthrough, we're going to think about the impact of disability on outcomes, as well as its relation to maltreatment types, because in the model results, we saw the impact of disability on the chance of adoption, as well as chance of aging out. So this first page shows just some overview results. So we have this bubble chart, which shows just the counts of, or the number of children who experience each type of maltreatment. And this is kind of what I was talking about with the multiple types of neglect that a child can, or multiple types of maltreatment, that a child can experience. So the total number that is made up by these bubbles is more than the total number of children who experience maltreatment in the data set. However, the number that is represented by each bubble is correct. So, for example, the amount of children who experience sex abuse, such as sex trafficking, is that 21,000 number. Secondly, we have this box plot on the left side, which shows the total days in foster care and the distribution of that. So we can look at the median, which is the line that's kind of dividing this box, and see that the median total days in foster care is 481. And then we can also see that the range is, the 0 number all the way up to somewhere in between 7,500 and 8,000. We also have some tables that just show simple counts and percentages of important variables. So child outcome, clinical disability, prior victim, as well as race and ethnicity. This bubble chart is also interactive. So if you clicked on a bubble, it would filter the next page. But for now, we're just going to look at the results for outcomes for all types of maltreatment. And so when we come to this bar chart in the top right corner, it's right now showing clinical disability, which is what we're interested in for this walkthrough. So we can see that aging out and adopted are the outcomes which have the highest proportion of children who are disabled. We can also use this drop down again to show a different variable within the bar chart. So if you were interested in race and ethnicity, you could click on that and it would show that. However, we are just interested in we are just interested in clinical disability for this walkthrough. So we will stick with considering that. So we can then go back to clinical disability, and we can look at the bubble chart, which shows the number of children who experience each outcome. So, for example, if you were interested in just children who were reunified, you could click on that, and it would show results on the next page for disability. We can also use these drop downs over here to filter by disability. So if you were just interested in children who are disabled, you could click on that and see the outcomes. Considering we have the bar chart filtered to clinical disability, this view isn't very helpful in terms of the bar chart, but it is helpful when looking at total days spent in foster care, the box plot on the bottom, as well as you can see the difference in the bubble chart. But we'll just stick with all for right now. So moving on to the results on disability, we can see another bar chart again in the top right corner. And this is showing the breakdown of disability for each maltreatment type. We can also see in the very top right corner the disability prevalence in the entire data set. So we can see that out of all the children in the data set, 22.6% of them are disabled. And if we remember from the aging out and the adopted on the last slide, the proportion that was disabled in those outcomes was far greater than the 22.6%. So we can say that children who are disabled disproportionately age out and are adopted from foster care. So in looking at this bar chart, we can see that medical neglect has a greater percentage of children who are disabled, again, than is the average in the data set. So we can again say that children who are disabled disproportionately experience medical neglect, as well as sex abuse and sex trafficking. Again, we have the filters in the bottom left that can be used to filter all the graphs on this page. So considering that we can see that medical neglect is disproportionately represented by children who are disabled, we can return to the overview and say that we just want to look at children who experience medical neglect. So if we click on that bubble, we come back to this page and we can see that when we look at children who experience medical neglect, an even higher proportion of those children who age out and who are adopted are represented by children who are disabled. We can also then look at the results on disability again. Once again, this isn't a super important view because we are only filtered by one type of maltreatment. But if we were interested in race and ethnicity, for example, we could see that, and we can see that children who experience medical neglect and children who are Black are disproportionately represented by children who are disabled. So considering those outcomes, especially looking at the results for medical neglect with the outcomes and looking at clinical disability within those outcomes, we can say that children who experience medical neglect disproportionately age out and are adopted, even more so, children who experience medical neglect and are disabled disproportionately age out and are adopted, even more so than when we look at all children in the data set. Although even all children in the data set, when considering all children, children who are disabled still age out and are adopted disproportionately. So keeping this in mind, some conclusions we can draw are that looking for adoptive families sooner, especially for children who are disabled and especially those who are disabled and experience medical neglect, could be useful, particularly because we saw earlier all of the detrimental impacts that aging out of the system can have on an individual. So if it's possible to find an adoptive family to prevent children from aging out, that would be beneficial to the child. Additionally, keeping in mind the Child Welfare Act and the necessity that states are required to make reasonable efforts to reunify children with their biological parents. We can also say that providing more resources, support, as well as financial support to families with disabled children could also be beneficial, because medical neglect is so prevalent among children who are disabled. This can be the financial resources could be useful in terms of helping to pay medical expenses and things along those lines. So all in all, the conclusion that we can draw from this walkthrough is that either adoptive families need to be a more prevalent option for children who are disabled and those who experience maltreatment, or more resources need to be provided to parents of children who are disabled and of those children who experience medical neglect. So this was an example of how you could walk through the dashboard and how it could be used to draw some conclusions. So I appreciate you all listening to my presentation. Please let me know if you have questions.